So now I want to turn to the second part of my talk. The National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Dating Committee serves as the official arbiter of recessions. And that committee has determined that the Great Recession began in December of 2007 and ended in June of 2009. During that time, real GDP fell by 4% and unemployment nearly doubled. Now, the Federal Reserve responded to the Great Recession and the associated financial crisis in a number of ways. But these responses fell largely into two classes. First, the Fed engaged in a vast amount of lending to firms believed to be in sound condition. It lent through conventional vehicles like the discount window and swaps with foreign central banks. But it also lent through relatively unconventional vehicles like the term asset-backed securities loan facility. I'll briefly discuss how this lending to institutions and firms believed to be in solvent condition is distinct from the Fed's injection of funds into obviously non-solvent institutions like AIG. Second, the second class of interventions, the Fed lowered the real interest rate facing borrowers and lenders. Now here I should clarify some terminology. When I use the term real interest rate, I'm referring to the interest rate received by lenders net of inflation. So if the interest rate on a loan says 5% and lenders expect inflation to be around 2%, the real interest rate is roughly 3%. And economists generally think that it's the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate, that matters for economic decision making. Now, early in the recession, the Fed lowered its target for the Fed funds rate. Given that inflation expectations remained stable, this action served to lower the real interest rate in the economy. But by early 2009, when the Fed funds target essentially reached its lower bound, the Fed had to turn to other ways to lower the real interest rate, and it used large-scale asset purchases to achieve further reductions in the real interest rate. So I'll first talk about the lending responses and then talk about the interest rate cuts. I'll then discuss how I believe economic events would have unfolded had there been no Fed. Now, to understand the Fed's responses to the events of 2007-2009, we need to take a step back. We need to take a step back to the second half of 2006. Now, at that point in time, firms and people around the world held a wide array of financial assets that were ultimately backed by U.S. residential land. So think, for example, of a mortgage-backed security or any asset backed by a mortgage-backed security. Eventually, at the end of the day, those were backed by United States residential land. Those investors, those people, firms and people, viewed those assets as being largely free of risk. Okay, remember, we're back in the second half of 2006. Investors may have understood that a fall in the value of U.S. land would impose large losses on them. However, they put low odds on such a decline taking place. Rather, they seemed to believe that U.S. land prices would continue to rise at a steady clip. By the second half of 2007, a year later, that belief began to unravel in the face of incoming data. People were beginning to learn the hard way that U.S. land was a risky investment. Now the only question was, how risky? And the uncertainty about the answer to that question planted the seeds for a global financial panic. Now, what do I mean by the term financial panic? So now, as an economist, I will define one term by using two new terms that need another definition. So financial panics are events that blur the line between liquidity and solvency. So what do liquidity and solvency mean? So a firm is said to be solvent if its revenues, in a discounted present value sense, exceed its expenditures. A firm is liquid if it is able to raise enough funds, either by borrowing or selling assets, to pay its current costs. Now, in a well-functioning financial market, a solvent firm is typically a liquid firm because they're able to borrow against their future profits. In a contrast, in a financial panic, lenders feel unable to assess the future profits and or the collateral of their borrowers. Borrowing becomes highly constrained, And even highly solvent firms may become illiquid. Now, as I mentioned, during the mid-2000s, many forms of collateral around the world were either implicitly or explicitly backed by U.S. residential land. And beginning in mid-2007, it became clear that this asset had more risk than financial markets had originally appreciated. It was not clear, though, how much more risk was involved. As a result, financial markets became increasingly uncertain about how to evaluate assets backed by U.S. land. That uncertainty translated to uncertainty about the ultimate solvency of any institution holding these assets and the ultimate solvency of any of those institutions' creditors, or their creditors, and so on. Spreads in credit markets between Treasury returns and other bond returns began to widen, at first slightly and then alarmingly. Now, I would say that most economists agree about how central banks should respond to financial panics. The crux of that agreed upon response is central banks have to be willing to lend freely to solvent firms against a wide range of good collateral at some kind of penalty rate. This policy is useful for two reasons. First, it provides a source of funds to potential borrowers who are illiquid but nonetheless solvent. Second, it provides a floor to collateral valuations. Private lenders now know they can always use the collateral seized from a defaulting borrower as a vehicle to borrow money from the central bank. So that baseline use for collateral serves to spur private lending. Now, beginning in mid-2007, the Fed took a number of actions consistent with its operating principle. It lent money to financial institutions through the discount window and its close cousin, the term auction facility. It injected liquidity into a broad range of essential credit markets through a veritable alphabet soup of special lending vehicles. In some sense, these interventions were typical for a central bank operating in the context of a financial panic. But the size of the problem meant that the operations were, to an extent, unprecedented in their scale. At their peak, the interventions made up more than $1 trillion of Federal Reserve assets. Now, there is no doubt that these interventions saved many solvent firms from collapse during the financial crisis. Over time, panic eased, and spreads in financial markets normalized. Once that happened, the private sector stopped borrowing from the Fed because it found the Fed's penalty rates too onerous. So as a result, the Fed was able to shut down its special lending facilities in 2010, last year. Now, it is plausible that the Fed's loans to the various special facilities exposed it, and by extension the American public, to some risk of loss. However, it is difficult to know how much risk was involved. So the way we generally try to measure a financial asset's risk is by the spread between its yield and that of a safe benchmark like U.S. Treasuries. But in a financial panic, a relatively large fraction of such a spread is attributable to illiquidity as opposed to intrinsic risk. And the goal of central bank's intervention is exactly to eliminate this panic-driven illiquidity. So accordingly, you can't really gauge the Fed's risk exposures without somehow correcting the spreads for the illiquidity factor that the Fed is intervening to eliminate. And this calculation strikes me as a non-trivial one. What we can say is that the Fed has not lost a penny on any of these transactions. Now, the lending that I have described, and I have to be clear about this, just differs greatly from the institution-specific assistance that the Federal Reserve provided to firms like AIG. Now, these institution-specific interventions were deemed necessary by the Fed and by the Bush administration because of deficiencies in the existing resolution regime for systemically important financial institutions. So the Dodd-Frank Act addresses these deficiencies. Simultaneously and correctly, the Dodd-Frank Act removes the Fed's ability to engage in institution-specific assistance. The Act does leave in place the Fed's ability to engage in the broad-based market interventions of the kind that I've already described, albeit with more congressional and White House oversight.